The world knows me as Lady Sophia, the goddess of silk whose stitch can save or destroy a kingdom. But to Duke Alaric, I was just the plain wife he threw away like trash. Now, his borders are crumbling and he's crawled to my feet for a miracle. He hasn't realized the woman he's begging to save his life is the same woman whose heart he broke 5 years ago. Welcome to Luna's Secret Library. On this channel, you can enjoy all sorts of romantic love stories. If you like my stories, please subscribe to my channel for more wonderful tales. The stone floor of the great hall was colder than a grave. I stood in the center of the candlelight, feeling 1,000 eyes piercing my skin. My dress was charcoal wool, heavy and plain. It was the dress Alaric told me was appropriate for a woman of my modest standing. But tonight, appropriate meant invisible. Evelyn, Alaric's voice boomed from the high dais. He was a man carved from granite and arrogance. His golden hair caught the light, making him look like a sun god among mortals. Beside him sat Lady Isabella, a flame in crimson silk. She leaned against my husband's shoulder, her smile a jagged shard of glass. "You have been a dutiful shadow for 5 years," Alaric said. His words were not a compliment, they were a sentence. But a duke requires a son, not a ghost. The guests whisper that my wife is a servant in fine rooms. They say you are as dull as the dust on the library shelves. I looked at the wine in my silver cup. It was trembling. No, my hand was trembling. The silence in the hall was a physical weight, crushing the air from my lungs. "I am a man of the sword and the crown," he continued, his eyes devoid of warmth. "I need a woman who commands the room, not one who hides in it." Isabella let out a soft, mocking titter. "Perhaps she simply lacks the texture, darling," she whispered, loud enough for the lords to hear. Alaric stood, his heavy cloak sweeping the floor. "Evelyn of the Lowlands, I hereby dissolve our union. You will leave Blackwood Castle before the moon sets. You will take nothing but the clothes on your back and your family's rusted heirlooms." A gasp rippled through the crowd. To be banished in the dead of winter was a death sentence. I looked up at him, my vision blurring for only a second. I remembered the girl I was before the marriage. The girl who could weave dreams out of simple thread. But he had forbidden it. He said a duchess's hands must be soft, not stained with dye and ink. He had clipped my wings and then mocked me for not flying. I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me. It was the feeling of a bone snapping back into place. I reached up and unlatched the heavy iron brooch from my shoulder. The wool sagged, exposing my thin frame. I walked to the dais, each step echoing like a hammer on an anvil. The guards shifted, but Alaric raised a hand. I reached the edge of his table and placed my gold wedding band on the wood. It looked small and pathetic next to his overflowing goblet of wine. "You wanted a son, Alaric?" I asked. My voice was quiet, but it had the edge of a winter gale. "You should have realized that shadows only exist where there is a light too bright to handle." He narrowed his eyes, a flicker of confusion crossing his handsome, cruel face. "Go back to your mud, Evelyn," he spat. "The world has no place for a woman as plain as you." I turned my back on him. I did not look at the lords who had once bowed to me. I did not look at the servants who pitied me. I walked out of the great hall, through the iron-bound doors. The wind outside screamed, tearing at my hair. Snow began to fall, white and unforgiving. I walked past the stables, past the outer walls, and into the dark moor of the forest. My feet went numb. My lungs burned with the frost. But deep in my pocket, I felt the sharp point of the silver shuttle. It was my grandmother's, hidden from Alaric for 5 long years. It began to glow. Not a bright light, but a deep, pulsing violet. The silk alchemist was not a legend. It was a bloodline. and Alaric had just thrown away the only thing that could have saved his crumbling kingdom. I didn't cry. The cold had turned my tears to ice before they could fall. Evelyn is dead, I whispered into the wind. She died in that hall of shadows. I saw a light in the distance, a hidden workshop built into the ancient roots of the world. I walked toward it. Behind me, the castle stood like a dying beast. They thought they banished a peasant. They didn't know they had unleashed a storm. 5 years of northern frost didn't just numb my skin, it turned my heart into a diamond that no blade could chip. The woman who crawled out of Blackwood Castle in a charcoal rags was dead, buried under the weight of 1,000 snowstorms. In her place rose Lady Sophia, a name whispered in the velvet halls of kings and the secret chambers of the Vatican. I spent the first year in the Iron Mountains, my fingers bleeding until the silver shuttle recognized my soul. I learned that the world is not made of stone and steel, but of vibrations and threads that connect the stars to the earth. My silk alchemy was no longer a peasant's hobby, but a power that could make a kingdom rise or fall with a single stitch. I wove the moonlight into veils that made plain women look like goddesses, and I wove the shadows into cloaks that made assassins invisible. My sanctuary was built from obsidian and hope, a fortress where the looms never stopped humming like a heartbeat. Wealth flowed into my coffers like a golden river, yet I never bought a single trinket to remind me of my past. Every coin was a bullet, every bolt of silk was a shield, and I was preparing for a war that Alaric didn't even know had started. The emissary is shivering in the courtyard, my lady, a voice rumbled, shaking the very foundations of my workshop. I didn't need to turn to know it was Silas, the high alpha of the northern wastes. He was a man who commanded the wolves and the winds, a warrior whose scars told stories of battles that gods had lost. Silas did not see a plain woman when he looked at me, he saw a sun that burned too bright for common eyes. He walked toward me, his heavy furs brushing against my shimmering gown of iridescent starlight. He carries the seal of the Blackwood Crow, Silas added, his eyes narrowing like a predator scenting blood. The man is desperate, begging for an audience with the woman who can save his bankrupt lands. I felt a cold, sharp spark of electricity dance along my fingertips, a physical manifestation of my growing power. Alaric, the man who called me as dull as dust, was now sending a beggar to my door. He had traded a diamond for a piece of cheap crimson glass, and now his glass was shattering under the pressure of reality. I heard that Isabella had turned his castle into a circus of vanity, spending their last gold on perfumes and parties. Their borders were crumbling, their soldiers were wearing rusted iron, and the neighboring lords were circling like vultures. "Does he know who I am, Silas?" I asked, my voice as smooth as liquid silver and twice as dangerous. "To him, you are a myth, a ghost of the north who holds the secret to the invincible weave," Silas replied with a dark chuckle. "He thinks he is coming to negotiate with a merchant, not a woman whose life he tried to extinguish." I walked to the massive loom in the center of the hall, touching the golden threads that were currently being infused with dragon scale dust. "Tell the messenger that I will accept the contract, but the price will not be paid in gold or jewels. I want the title deeds to the Blackwood Valley, and I want a public invitation to the winter solstice masquerade." Silas placed a heavy, warm hand on my shoulder, a gesture of absolute loyalty and unspoken affection. "You are going back to that den of snakes," he whispered, his voice thick with a protective growl. "I am going back as the owner of the snakes," I corrected him, turning to face the man who had stayed by my side through the darkness. "And you, Silas, will be my shadow, the wolf that reminds them why they should never have awakened the storm." The silver shuttle in my hand began to glow with a fierce, violet intensity, reacting to the malice in my heart. 5 years ago, I left that castle with nothing but a rusted heirloom and a broken spirit. Now, I would return with a fleet of black silk carriages and the power to buy his ancestors' souls. Alaric wanted a woman who could command a room? I would show him a woman who could command an era. The North had finished its work, the blade was sharp, the thread was strong, and the trap was set. "Prepare the obsidian carriage," I commanded, my eyes reflecting the cold fire of the mountains. "It's time for the plain woman to remind the Duke that some ghosts are too powerful to be laid to rest." The iron gates of Blackwood Castle groaned like a dying beast. 5 years ago, they had closed behind a broken girl in a ragged cloak. Today, they trembled before the arrival of a legend. My obsidian carriage cut through the grey mist like a shard of the midnight sky. Outside, the village was a shadow of its former glory. Hungry eyes peered from broken windows, watching the gold-trimmed wheels roll by. I sat inside the velvet interior, my heart as steady as a glacier. Across from me, Silas adjusted the hilt of his massive broadsword. He looked at me, his icy blue eyes softened by a fierce, protective heat. "Are you ready to face your ghosts, Sophia?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. I touched the translucent violet veil that hid my face from the world. "I am not here to face them, Silas," I whispered. "I am here to replace them." The carriage came to a halt in the center of the grand courtyard. The same courtyard where Alaric had once stood and told me I was unworthy of his name. I heard the frantic whispers of the servants. "Is it her? Is it the Empress of Silk? Look at the banners, the Northern Wolf is guarding her." The carriage door was opened by a guard who was shaking with visible fear. I stepped out, and the air seemed to freeze in a collective gasp. My gown was a masterpiece of liquid starlight and crushed amethysts. Every movement caused the fabric to ripple like moonlight on dark water. It was a dress that cost more than the entire Blackwood treasury. I walked forward, the train of my dress hissing against the stained stone. And there he was. Alaric, the Duke of Blackwood, stood at the base of the stone stairs. He looked older, the lines of arrogance on his face replaced by the hollow marks of desperation. Beside him stood Isabella, her crimson dress looking cheap and gaudy compared to my elegance. She was clutching his arm, her eyes wide with a mix of jealousy and awe. Alaric stepped forward, his head bowing low, lower than I had ever seen it. "Lady Sophia," he said, his voice straining to remain steady. "Blackwood is honored by your presence." I didn't speak. I let the silence stretch until it became an insult. I looked at him through the shimmer of my veil. His eyes met mine, and for a split second, I saw a flash of confusion cross his face. He was searching for something in my gaze, a memory, a spark of familiarity. But he found only the cold, hard brilliance of a stranger. "The Duke is a beggar now, I see," Silas said, stepping up behind me like a mountain of shadow. Alaric stiffened, his jaw tightening at the insult. But he couldn't afford to be angry. He needed my alchemy to save his crumbling borders. He needed my name to restore his credit with the king. "I am prepared to offer whatever price you demand, my lady," Alaric said, his eyes fixed on my veiled face. I walked closer, until I could smell the faint scent of the wine he had been drinking to forget his failures. "Whatever price?" I asked, my voice a melodic blade. Isabella flinched at the sound, her grip tightening on Alaric's sleeve. "I have heard that Blackwood is famous for its history," I continued, circling him like a predator. "But all I see is a house built on dust and pride." Alaric flinched as if I had struck him. "I seek the invincible weave, my lady," he pleaded. "My soldiers are falling, and my lands are being seized." I stopped directly in front of him, my starlight dress casting a glow on his weary face. "I will grant you the weave, Alaric," I said, using his name for the first time. He shivered at the sound of it, a strange look of longing flickering in his eyes. "But you will sign over the deed to the silent forest by sunset. And you will host a masquerade in my honor where every noble must bow to my shadow." Alaric hesitated, his pride warring with his necessity. "The silent forest it belonged to my first wife's family," he stammered. "A woman you discarded like a weed, I replied coldly. If she is gone, then the land is mine to take. He looked down at the ground, the weight of his guilt finally visible. Very well, he whispered. The terms are accepted. I turned away from him, my silk cape billowing in the wind. Then prepare the hall, I commanded without looking back. And make sure the wine is better than the company. As I walked away, I felt Alaric's gaze burning into my back. He didn't know who I was yet. But he was already falling under the spell of the woman he had destroyed. The trap was set, the threads were tightened, and the hunt had officially begun. The grand ballroom was a cage of golden lies. 1,000 candles flickered, but they couldn't chase away the chill of my presence. I stood at the top of the marble staircase, looking down at the people who had once laughed at my plain wool dresses. Tonight, I was not a woman, I was a miracle draped in shadow silk. My gown rippled from deep obsidian to blinding silver with every breath I took. I wore a mask crafted from midnight lace and crushed diamonds, hiding my eyes but revealing my soul's hunger. Silas stood half a step behind me, his black armor absorbing the light like a black hole. He placed a gloved hand on the small of my back, a silent promise of destruction if anyone dared to touch me. Below us, the music died a sudden, stuttering death. Every nobleman and lady stood frozen, their wine cups forgotten in their hands. Alaric was standing in the center of the floor, his eyes widening until I could see the whites around his pupils. He looked like a man who had seen a goddess walking among the ruins of his life. Beside him, Isabella's face was a mask of painted fury and desperate insecurity. I descended the stairs, the sound of my silk train hitting the stone like the whisper of 1,000 ghosts. I didn't wait for an introduction, I didn't need one. Duke Alaric, I said, my voice echoing in the hollow silence. Your castle is much darker than I remembered from the stories. Alaric took a step forward, drawn to me like a moth to a flame that intended to consume him. Lady Sophia, he whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying realization. You move like someone I used to know. I let out a soft, melodic laugh that felt like a needle to his heart. Every woman you've ever met is merely a shadow of what I am, Duke. He reached out a hand, hesitating in the air as if he were afraid I would vanish if he touched me. Will you grant me the honor of a dance? He asked, his pride crumbling in front of his entire court. I saw Isabella's knuckles turn white as she gripped her fan, but she stayed silent, terrified of my power. I placed my hand in his, and I felt him shiver at the coldness of my touch. We moved to the center of the hall as the orchestra began a slow, haunting waltz. As we spun, I leaned in close, my lips brushing against his ear. Tell me, Alaric, I whispered, do you often dream of the things you throw away? He missed a step, his breath hitching in his throat. I dreamed of a son, he stammered, his eyes searching mine through the mask. But I am beginning to realize that I was blinded by the glare of cheap glass. He looked at Isabella, and for the first time, I saw genuine disgust in his gaze. The woman I banished, she was plain, but she was real, he whispered, more to himself than to me. And you, I countered, spinning away and then pulling back in, you are just a man who realized he is starving only after he burned the fields. Suddenly, a sharp cry broke the tension of the dance. Isabella had lunged forward, her face distorted by a jealous rage she could no longer contain. Who are you? She screamed, reaching for my mask with clawed fingers. You come here with your northern gold and your magic clothes, making him forget his wife. Before her hand could even come close, Silas was there, moving faster than a mountain had any right to. He caught her wrist in a grip that made the bones audibly groan. Isabella fell to her knees, sobbing in pain and humiliation before the entire assembly. Alaric didn't move to help her, he didn't even look at her. He was still staring at me, his eyes filled with a desperate, pathetic hope. She is nothing to me, Alaric said, his voice cold and flat. If you want her gone, Sophia, I will have her thrown into the dungeons tonight. I looked down at the woman who had stolen my bed and my title, and I felt nothing. I don't care about your servants, Alaric, I said, my voice dripping with disdain. I am here for the debt, not the drama. I pulled my hand from his and turned to Silas. The air in here is stagnant, I commanded. We leave. As I walked away, I felt Alaric's world collapsing behind me. He was standing in the middle of his ballroom, surrounded by his people, yet he had never been more alone. He wanted a savior, but I was the executioner he had invited to his own hanging. The silver shuttle in my bodice hummed with a dark, satisfied energy. He was starting to remember the plain girl. And the more he remembered, the more he would suffer. Because the girl he remembered no longer existed. And the woman who stood before him would never, ever forgive. The ink on the deed was still wet, but the power had already shifted. The silent forest was no longer a graveyard of memories, it was my fortress. I stood on the edge of the clearing, watching the first shimmering threads of sunsilk being woven by the wind. By my side, Silas surveyed the perimeter, his presence a wall of impenetrable shadow. The people of Blackwood were no longer looking toward the castle for hope. They were crawling toward the forest, begging for the chance to work at my looms. I saw the mothers who had lost sons to Alaric's useless wars. I saw the old men whose hands were calloused from tilling soil that gave them nothing back. I gave them bread, I gave them gold, and most importantly, I gave them a purpose. You are building an army of hearts, Sophia, Silas rumbled, his voice filled with pride. I am building a reality where Alaric is a footnote in his own history, I replied. Every yard of silk produced in this forest was a nail in the coffin of his reign. Word reached me that the Duke had sold the last of his family's silver to pay his guards. Isabella had been moved to the North Tower, stripped of her servants and her silks. She was a bird with clipped wings, screeching at a sky that no longer cared. And then, he came. Alaric rode through the forest gates alone, his armor dull and his horse exhausted. He didn't come as a conqueror, he came as a man looking for a miracle. He stopped before the great weaving hall, his eyes taking in the impossible beauty of the place. The air here smelled of jasmine and ozone, a sharp contrast to the damp rot of his castle. I stepped out onto the balcony, my dress a flowing river of emerald and gold. He looked up at me, and I saw a man who was drowning in his own regret. Sophia, he called out, his voice cracking like dry parchment. The neighboring lords have crossed the river. They are burning the eastern villages. I leaned against the railing, looking down at him with the cold curiosity of a scientist. And what does that have to do with me, Alaric? I asked. He flinched as if I had splashed him with boiling water. You promised the enchanted weave. You promised to save the borders, he shouted. I promised to fulfill a contract, not to fight your wars for you, I corrected him. I signaled to the workers below, who were moving massive bolts of shielding silk. The fabric glowed with a faint blue light, capable of stopping any arrow known to man. The silk is ready for those who can pay the interest on their debt, I said. Alaric fell to his knees in the mud, his pride finally breaking under the weight of his failure. I gave you everything you asked for. I gave you the forest. I gave you the deeds. I walked down the stairs, my silk shoes never touching the filth of the ground. I stopped just out of his reach, the scent of my power making him dizzy. You gave me back what was already mine, I whispered, my voice a lethal caress. You thought you were being generous by returning a stolen soul. He looked at my face, searching for the girl who used to wait by the fire for him. He was looking for the girl who would have forgiven him with a single smile. But that girl had died in the snow 5 years ago. Please, he choked out, reaching for the hem of my dress. Silas moved instantly, his heavy boot pinning Alaric's hand to the earth. Do not touch what you cannot afford to buy, Duke, Silas growled, his eyes flashing with a wolf's hunger. Alaric looked at Silas, then back at me, the realization finally hitting him like a physical blow. He saw the way Silas looked at me, with a devotion that Alaric had never been capable of. He saw that I was not just a designer, I was a queen who had found her king. "You never loved me," Alaric whispered, his eyes filling with bitter tears. "No, Alaric," I said, turning my back on him for the final time today. "I loved the version of you I created in my head. But you? You were always just a plain man with a heavy crown." I walked back into my sanctuary, the doors closing with a final, heavy thud. Outside, the rain began to fall, washing away the last of his dignity. The silent forest was alive with the sound of 1,000 looms. It was the sound of a new era beginning. And in this era, the plain woman was the only one holding the shears. The debt was growing. And Alaric was running out of time to pay. The dawn over the Crimson Valley was choked with the thick stench of burning oil and spilled blood. Alaric's remaining soldiers were backed against the river, their shields splintering under the heavy assault of the Eastern Alliance. Arrows rained from the sky like a plague of iron locusts. But this time, they did not bite into flesh. The shielding silk wrapped around the Blackwood vanguard flared with a blinding, ethereal blue light. Iron arrowheads shattered into harmless dust upon impact. Heavy broadswords bounced off the thin, shimmering fabric as if striking an invisible wall of diamond. A roar of disbelief echoed through the enemy ranks. Alaric rode at the front, his chest swelling with a dangerous, intoxicating surge of his old pride. He held his sword high, convinced that the magic of the silk had restored his rightful place as a conqueror. "Push them back into the mud." Alaric screamed, his voice raw with the desperate need for victory. "The Duke of Blackwood does not fall today." He actually believed the worst was over. He actually believed that burning his family banner was a temporary setback in a long, glorious reign. He forgot that the silk did not belong to him. Suddenly, the ground began to tremble beneath the boots of thousands of fighting men. It was not the tremor of a cavalry charge, it was the rhythmic, terrifying heartbeat of the Iron Mountains. A solitary horn blew from the northern ridge, a sound so deep it vibrated in the marrow of every soldier's bones. The fighting stopped organically, men on both sides freezing as they looked toward the high ground. A massive banner unfurled against the wind, black as a void, embroidered with a silver shuttle and a howling wolf. Silas appeared over the crest, leading an army of northern elites who moved with the lethal grace of apex predators. But Silas was not the one leading the formation. She was. I rode a warhorse as black as a nightmare, clad in armor woven entirely from midnight silk and star-forged steel. My violet veil caught the morning sun, transforming me into a terrifying beacon of absolute power. I looked down at the valley of slaughter, feeling nothing but a cold, calculating resolve. Alaric looked up at me, a delirious smile breaking across his blood-spattered face. "The Empress honors her pact." Alaric shouted to the Eastern general. "You cannot defeat the magic of Lady Sophia." He was trying to use my name as his shield. I raised my right hand, holding the glowing silver shuttle high for both armies to see. I did not issue a command with my voice, I issued it with my will. The blue light radiating from the Blackwood soldiers' armor suddenly flared, shifting violently into a deep, aggressive violet. With a sound like snapping ice, the silk tightened. It did not suffocate them, but it locked every joint, turning Alaric's entire vanguard into paralyzed statues. Alaric dropped his sword, his arm frozen mid-air, panic finally replacing the false bravado in his eyes. "What are you doing?" he screamed, struggling against the very fabric he had begged me for. "I paid your price. I burned the crown." I urged my horse forward, descending the ridge with Silas at my side, moving through the parted sea of enemy soldiers. The Eastern warriors did not raise their weapons against me. Their general, a hardened veteran of 100 wars, drove his sword into the dirt and dropped to one knee as I passed. He knew that fighting the Weaver of Fate was a death sentence. I stopped my horse mere inches from where Alaric stood imprisoned in his own enchanted armor. The battlefield was completely silent, save for the wind whipping across the banners. "You bought the silk, Alaric," I said, my voice echoing like a judgment across the valley. "But you never read the fine print of my alchemy." I reached up with a gauntleted hand and slowly unpinned the violet veil from my face. The fabric slipped away, falling into the mud. I let him see the cold, unyielding face of the woman he had thrown into the winter storms. I let him see the plain features he had mocked, now illuminated by the terrifying glow of absolute supremacy. A collective gasp rippled through the Blackwood ranks who recognized the ghost of their discarded Duchess. Alaric's eyes widened so far I thought they might bleed. His lips trembled as the ultimate, devastating truth finally crushed the last pillar of his sanity. "Evelyn?" He whimpered, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "I told you, Evelyn died in the snow," I replied, leaning down from the saddle. "I am the owner of this land, the master of this army, and the architect of your ruin." I looked at the Eastern general, who was still kneeling in the dirt. "The Blackwood territory belongs to the Sanctuary of Silk now," I announced. "Any man who sheds blood on my soil will find his armor turned to dust and his weapons turned to snakes." The general bowed his head lower. "We concede to the Empress. We will withdraw." I turned my gaze back to Alaric, who was weeping openly, tears cutting clean lines through the grime on his face. He was a duke without a banner, a commander without an army, and a man without a future. "Take him back to the castle," I ordered Silas, without breaking eye contact with my broken ex-husband. "Throw him in the servants' quarters. He needs to be well rested to watch me tear down everything his ancestors ever built." The war was over, one without a single blade drawn by my hand. The Alpha had been brought to heel, not by another man, but by the plain woman he could not break. The great hall of Blackwood was a tomb of echoes and shadows. It was the same room where my heart had been shattered 5 years ago. But tonight, the air did not smell of winter, it smelled of ozone and expensive jasmine. I sat upon the high throne, the cold stone pressing against my spine like a silent witness. My gown was a masterpiece of void silk, a fabric that seemed to swallow the light around me. Beside me stood Silas, a mountain of raw power and unyielding loyalty. His hand rested on the hilt of his broadsword, his eyes scanning the crowd with a predator's calm. Below the dais, the nobility of the realm were gathered in a sea of trembling silk. These were the men who had toasted to my exile. These were the women who had laughed when Alaric called me, as plain as dust. Now, they dared not even breathe in my presence. "Bring in the servant," I commanded, my voice echoing like a tolling bell. The heavy oak doors groaned open. A figure emerged from the darkness, shuffling and broken. It was Alaric, the former Duke of Blackwood. He was dressed in a tattered, charcoal wool tunic, the exact same garment I had worn the night he banished me. His feet were bare and bleeding, leaving dark stains on the marble floor. The crowd let out a collective, horrified gasp. To see a high alpha reduced to a scullery maid was a sight that defied the laws of nature. Alaric walked toward the throne, his head bowed, his hands shaking as he carried a heavy silver tray. On the tray sat 2 cups of my finest, starfire, wine. He stopped at the foot of the stairs, unable to look me in the eye. "The guest is waiting, Alaric," I said, my voice dripping with icy sweetness. Alaric turned toward Silas, his jaw tightening in a spasm of pure, unadulterated agony. He had to serve the man who had claimed his lands, his title, and the woman he now realized was a goddess. Alaric poured the wine, the liquid red and dark, smelling of crushed berries and ancient magic. "Your wine, my lord," Alaric whispered, his voice a pathetic rasp. Silas took the cup, his gaze never leaving Alaric's broken face. The service in this house has improved, Silas rumbled, his voice shaking the rafters. It seems the new help understands his place. I saw a tear fall from Alaric's eye and vanish into the wine tray. Now, pour for the Empress, Silas ordered, his tone leaving no room for refusal. Alaric turned back to me, his hands trembling so violently the silver rattled. As he filled my cup, I leaned forward, letting the violet glow of my shuttle illuminate the hollows of his face. Tell me, Alaric, I whispered, loud enough for every noble in the hall to hear. Does the wool feel different when it's your own skin that it's scratching? He let out a choked sob, falling to his knees at my feet. Evelyn, kill me, just kill me and end this, he pleaded, the wine cup falling and shattering on the stone. I watched the red liquid spread across the floor, looking like a fresh wound. Death is for those who have finished their work, Alaric, I replied coldly. You still have so much to learn about being invisible. Suddenly, a piercing scream erupted from the back of the hall. Isabella was dragged forward by two of my northern guards. She was wearing a dress of stolen crimson silk, but it looked like a shroud on her gaunt frame. Her red hair was matted with sweat and dirt, her face a mask of painted desperation. You stole him, she shrieked, pointing a clawed finger at me. You used your witchcraft to bewitch the Alpha. I stood up, and the entire hall seemed to darken in response to my movement. I walked down the stairs, each step a hammer blow to her crumbling sanity. I stopped in front of her, looking down at the woman who had thought herself my superior. I didn't steal him, Isabella, I said, my voice a melodic blade. I simply waited for the world to show him what a bargain basement prize you really were. I reached out and touched her cheek with one finger. A tiny spark of silk alchemy jumped from my skin to hers. She let out a horrified wail as her vibrant red hair began to turn grey and brittle. The artificial glow of her skin faded, revealing the shallow, bitter lines of her true nature. Within seconds, the beauty that had seduced Alaric was gone, replaced by the grey ash of her inner rot. Take her to the weaver's sheds, I commanded. She will work the heavy looms for 14 hours a day. Let her see if her texture can withstand the friction of honest labor. Isabella was dragged away, her screams echoing through the corridors until they were swallowed by the wind. I turned back to Alaric, who was still staring at the floor in a trance of despair. And as for you, Alaric, I said, returning to my throne. You will remain in this castle. You will clean these floors. You will serve my guests. You will watch as I turn this graveyard into a garden that you are never allowed to touch. I took Silas's hand, and he pulled me close, his warmth a sharp contrast to the coldness of my revenge. The nobles fell to their knees, their foreheads hitting the stone with a rhythmic thud of submission. The plain woman was the only light left in Blackwood. And for Alaric, the darkness was just beginning to settle. He realized, with the crushing weight of a collapsing mountain, that I was not his wife anymore. I was his master. And there would be no forgiveness in this life, or the next. The sun did not rise over the ruins of Blackwood, it rose over a new world, one that had been meticulously woven from the ashes of a discarded life. The grey, damp stones that had once symbolized the stifling tradition of the Dukes of Blackwood were gone, replaced by an architecture of dreams. The castle walls were now clad in translucent obsidian, a substance born of fire and cooled by the absolute stillness of the north. Within the obsidian were veins of glowing silk, pulsing with a soft violet light that matched the rhythm of the earth's own heartbeat. This was no longer a fortress designed to keep enemies out, it was a sanctuary built to invite the future in. I stood on the highest spire of the Starweaver Tower, the wind whipping my hair around my face like a river of liquid silver. 5 years ago, this wind would have bitten into my skin, reminding me of my poverty, my plainness, and my insignificance. Today, the wind was a servant, carrying the scent of jasmine and salt from the newly opened harbors. I was no longer the girl who shivered in charcoal wool. I was Evelyn, the architect of the infinite weave, and the woman who had brought the proudest alphas of the southern realms to their knees. Behind me, the heavy obsidian doors slid open with a sound like a mountain shifting. I didn't need to turn to know it was Silas. His presence was a physical weight, a wall of heat and protective power that had become the foundation of my new existence. Silas, the high alpha of the northern wastes, a man whose name once made kings tremble, now moved through my halls with the quiet reverence of a devotee in a temple. He did not seek to own me, as Alaric once had. He sought only to stand beside the son I had become. The southern ports have officially recognized the Silk Decree, Silas said, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated in the air. The kings of the desert and the lords of the sea have signed the treaties. They are no longer asking for your trade, Sophia. They are begging for your patronage. They realize that a kingdom without the enchanted weave is a kingdom that will fall behind in the coming age. I looked down at the courtyard far below. From this height, the people looked like colorful threads moving through a grand design. They moved with a grace and dignity that was entirely new. Under Alaric's rule, the commoners were shadows, hunched by labor and fear. Now, they were dressed in tunics of cloud silk, fabric that adapted to the temperature of their bodies, protecting them from the harsh elements. I had turned a population of peasants into a civilization of creators. And in the very center of that courtyard, in the shadow of a massive marble statue of myself, was a man with a broom. Alaric was a ghost of the man he once was. His golden hair, which he had once prized as a symbol of his sun-god lineage, was now the color of stale ash, thin and brittle. He was dressed in the same rough, charcoal wool that he had forced me to wear for 5 years. The fabric was heavy, coarse, and caustic, scratching against his skin with every movement. He spent his days sweeping the footprints of the people who used to fear his name. He was a living monument to the fragility of pride. He was forced to clean the plaza that bore my name, to look up at the towering monuments of the woman he had called dull and plain. Every time he lifted his eyes, he was reminded of the soul he had failed to see, the diamond he had mistaken for a common pebble. I watched him stop for a moment. His hands, once used to gripping the hilts of master-crafted swords, were now calloused and stained with the soot of the city. He leaned against the broom handle, his chest heaving with exhaustion. He looked up at the tower, his eyes searching the high balcony for even a glimpse of the woman he couldn't forget. I felt a cold, crystalline peace as I looked at him. There was no anger left, no burning desire for more pain. Those emotions required a connection, a thread of care that had long since been severed. To me, Alaric was no more significant than a knot in a piece of scrap silk. He was a fragment of a past that had no place in my future. He still waits for the summons, Silas murmured, stepping up to the railing beside me. He tells the other servants that one day, you will remember the love you once shared. He believes that if he suffers enough, if he humbles himself in the dirt long enough, you will eventually find it in your heart to forgive him. I let out a soft, melodic laugh that was carried away by the wind. Forgiveness is a luxury for the weak, Silas. Alaric didn't just break a marriage, he tried to extinguish a goddess. He looked at the most powerful lineage in the world and saw only a convenience. He didn't love me, he loved the idea of a shadow that made his own light seem brighter. Now that the shadow has become the sun, he realizes he has no light of his own. I reached into the bodice of my gown and pulled out the silver shuttle. It pulsed with a fierce, blinding violet energy, vibrating with the power of 1,000 suns. This was the secret of my plainness. My ancestors, the original weavers of the world, had learned that true power does not need to shout. It disguises itself in the ordinary, waiting for a heart that is worthy of seeing the truth. Alaric had been tested, and he had failed. Silas had been tested, and he had seen the fire in the stone before I even knew it was there. The fleet is ready for the new continent, I announced, turning my back on the courtyard and the broken man within it. We have finished our work here. Blackwood is no longer a graveyard, it is a garden. Let the memory of the plain woman be the soil that feeds it. And what of him? Silas asked, gesturing toward Alaric. He cannot survive the winter in those rags. Then let him find warmth in his regrets, I replied, my voice as sharp and final as a diamond blade. He will stay here. He will sweep these floors until his last breath. He will watch the world I build, and he will know that he was the only thing standing in the way of his own greatness. That is the only justice that matters. I walked toward the obsidian carriage that would take us to the harbor. I thought of Isabella, who was now working the caustic vats in the lowest level of the weavers' huts. She had lost her beauty, her voice, and her pride, realizing too late that a life built on stolen brilliance is a house built on sand. She and Alaric were the twin pillars of a dead era, and I was moving toward a horizon that they could never imagine. As we boarded the flagship of the Silk Fleet, the sails, made of iridescent dragon silk, caught the wind and flared like the wings of a god. I looked back one last time at the Starweaver Tower. The sun was at its zenith, and the obsidian was glowing with a light that could be seen for 100 miles. Alaric was still there, a tiny, dark speck in the center of the brilliant plaza, reaching his arms toward the sea in a silent, pathetic plea. But the distance was too great. The world had moved on. I took Silas's hand, feeling the strength and the absolute loyalty in his grip. We were heading toward the edge of the map, toward lands where the silk was made of liquid fire and the stars whispered the secrets of the ancients. The plain woman was gone. The Empress of Silk and Shadow had risen. And the thread of fate was finally, perfectly, in my hands. I did not look back again. The past was a finished tapestry, and I was already weaving the future. The alpha who couldn't forget was left with exactly what he deserved, a memory that would haunt him until the end of time, and the realization that the woman he threw away was the only thing that could have made him immortal. I was free. I was powerful. And I was never, ever coming back. The ocean was not a boundary, it was a vast, shimmering canvas of liquid sapphire, and our fleet was the needle that threaded its way toward the unknown. The new continent loomed on the horizon like a dream of burning gold and deep obsidian. It was a land where the sun did not merely shine, it pulsated with a primal, ancient energy that made the very air vibrate. We had left the rotting carcass of the old world behind, and with every league we gained, the memory of Alaric and his grey, stone-bound kingdom faded like a bad dream at the break of dawn. Silas stood at the prow of the flagship, his black furs replaced by a suit of eon silk that shimmered with the shifting colors of a dying nebula. He looked like a god of the sea, his eyes reflecting the vastness of the horizon. He was the only man who had ever dared to look at the plain woman and see the fire within the stone. In this new world, he was not my master, but my guardian, the wolf who stood at the gates of my temple. We were building a civilization where the old rules of blood and birth were as obsolete as rusted iron. The city we built on the shores of the new continent was called Ethelgard. It was an impossible fusion of nature and alchemy. The trees were woven together with silver threads to form living cathedrals, and the rivers were diverted through channels of translucent crystal to power the great looms that hummed day and night. Here, I discovered that liquid fire, silk, a fabric woven from the volcanic veins of the earth itself. It was a material so radiant that it could illuminate a city, so strong that it could deflect the breath of a dragon. As the years passed, the legend of the Silk Goddess spread back across the ocean like a wildfire. Travelers from the old lands spoke of a woman who had transcended humanity, a weaver who held the threads of fate in her hands. They told stories of the plain empress, who had turned the north into a paradise and left the south to wither in its own arrogance. And always, at the heart of these stories, was the mention of the man who had let her go, the duke who had traded a star for a piece of charcoal. Back in Blackwood, time had not been kind. The once mighty castle was now a museum of mourning. The obsidian walls remained, but they no longer pulsed with the violet light I had imbued within them. Without the weaver's touch, the alchemy was slowly fading, turning the fortress into a cold, silent tomb. The nobles who had once mocked me were now impoverished, their lands seized by creditors and their titles rendered meaningless by the economic dominance of my new empire. Alaric was still there. He was an old man now, though his years were measured more by sorrow than by time. He was the head sweeper of the Plaza of Regret, a title the people had mockingly given to the space surrounding my central statue. Every day, for a decade, he had swept the same stones. Every day, he had looked up at the marble face of the woman he had failed to see. His mind was a fractured mirror, reflecting only the moments of his greatest failures. He had become a tourist attraction. Travelers from distant lands would pay a copper to see the Full of Blackwood. They would point at him and whisper to their children, "Look at the man who had the goddess in his house and called her plain. Look at the man who threw away the world because he was too small to hold it." Alaric would not look at them. He would only sweep, his movements mechanical and hollow, his eyes fixed on the dust. He kept a small, tattered piece of charcoal wool in his pocket, the last remnant of the dress I had worn on the night of my banishment. He would touch it in the dark, trying to summon the ghost of the girl I used to be. He wanted the girl who would cry for him. He wanted the girl who would forgive him with a single touch. But that girl had been consumed by the fire of the north long ago. The woman who remained was an entity of light and law, a being who did not know the meaning of mercy for those who had tried to break her. One winter morning, a young noblewoman from the southern kingdoms arrived at Ethelgard. She was a distant relative of Alaric's, sent to beg for a drop of the liquid fire to save her dying province. I received her in the Hall of Infinite Threads, a room where the ceiling was a tapestry of the actual stars, moving in real time. I sat upon a throne of woven light, Silas standing like a shadow of death at my side. "My lady," the young woman whispered, her face pressed against the cool crystal floor. "The Duke of Blackwood is dying. He has sent me with a final plea. He does not ask for gold, or silk, or land. He asks only for a single word from you. A word of forgiveness, so that his soul may find peace in the darkness." I looked down at her, the silver shuttle in my hand glowing with a soft, indifferent violet. "A word?" I asked, my voice echoing like the shifting of tectonic plates. "He spent 5 years giving me words of iron and ash. He spent 5 years telling me that my existence was a shadow on his glory. Why should I give him a word now, when he is nothing but a footnote in the history I am writing?" "He says he has realized the truth," the woman pleaded. "He says he sees you in every sunrise. He says his heart is a loom that weaves only your name." "Then his heart is weaving a shroud," I replied, standing up. "Go back to your dying province. I will give you the fire silk you need to save your people, for they are innocent of his crimes. But tell the Duke this: the goddess he seeks does not remember him. To her, he is not a man, or an enemy, or a lover. He is simply a broken thread that was removed to make the pattern perfect." The young woman left, trembling with a mixture of terror and awe. She returned to the old world with the silk that would save her people, but she also brought the final blow to Alaric's heart. When Alaric heard my message, he did not weep. He simply put down his broom and walked to the base of my statue. He sat there in the cold, the grey snow falling around him like the ash of his own life. He looked up at the marble eyes that would never look back at him, and he finally understood the true nature of his punishment. It wasn't that I hated him. It was that I had truly, finally, moved beyond him. He was a speck of dust on the horizon of my eternity. He died that night, clutching the piece of charcoal wool. He died in the shadow of the woman he couldn't forget, in a castle that had become a monument to his stupidity. There was no funeral. There were no banners. The new administrators of Blackwood simply moved his body and hired a new sweeper the next morning. The world didn't stop. The looms didn't miss a beat. In Ethelgard, I felt a faint tug on the silver shuttle, a microscopic release of tension in the weave of the world. I didn't need to ask Silas what it meant. I simply looked out at the ocean, where the sun was beginning to set in a riot of liquid fire and gold. The pattern is finished, I whispered to the wind. Silas placed his hand on mine, his grip firm and warm. And the next one, my queen? I smiled, a smile that contained the power of 1,000 empires and the peace of a woman who had conquered her own soul. The next one will be even more beautiful, Silas. We are going to weave the sky itself. The empire of the silk goddess continued to grow, stretching across the world until the very concept of plainness was forgotten. Every woman was taught that within her was a weaver, a shaper of destiny who did not need the validation of an alpha to be brilliant. The story of Alaric became a cautionary tale, a myth told to children about the danger of arrogance and the blindness of the small-minded. I never looked back at the old world. I never visited the grave of the man who had tried to break me. I was too busy creating, too busy exploring the infinite possibilities of the thread. I had become the eternal empress, the goddess of the loom, and my name was written in the stars for all eternity. The alpha couldn't forget. But the empress had never even intended to remember. The threads were locked. The knot was tied. The masterpiece was complete.